Now, let me turn to Mr. Ajay Bohora. Sir, you are like me, not into education, but you're looking at it from outside in a manner of speaking. So, how do you see this aspect that we are discussing? Are the educational institutions ready with their current format and structure for receiving these funds? And as somebody who's actively working in this space, what are your thoughts on the educational institutions' role in making sure the funds reach them?
Thank you, Mr. Ramaswamy, and I really appreciate the opportunity given by FICCI. So if we look at the context, meaning it's a good thing and it's a valid thing that we should be asking for the funds from the government and the corporates and various other entities. But if we take a glance at what are the prevailing realities of today's world, if we see all the household savings of India, all India put together, how much does all the households save? They amount to about 14.1 lakh crore. Now, on one hand, entire savings, the household savings, of course, the corporate savings would be in addition, but out of 14.1 lakh crore that gets saved by the households, Government of India borrows 11 lakh crore. See, whenever we need money, somebody has to save the money, and then that money can be utilized for whatever purpose, maybe higher education or whatever form of education. But given the fact that there is very little saving in India which is not being used. Now, let's be mindful of the fact that out of 14 lakh crore, 11 lakh crore is getting absorbed by the government, the central government. Lenders also need, the banks, non-bank finance companies, they also need money to lend. That has to come from maybe, let's say, corporate savings or other avenues. So let's take that as a context, that the money available over the next few years when our country is growing is relatively limited. That's one part. Now, second, if we see that, if we call it AC and BC, before COVID and after COVID, what are the new realities of our life and the economy? And what are the next normals? Because we create students for the future and for the economy. So we cannot be disconnected with that. So the ground realities or the next normals or the current realities are the fact that hybrid mode of communication and delivery is now omnipresent. It's an accepted fact that we need to have mixed mode of teaching or learning be integrated into our system. Second new reality is, if we look at the infrastructure, now just to give some numbers for the context, now if we look at IIT Kharagpur, it has 2,100 acres of land. Now, Kharagpur also gets 438 crores of government grant. Also, if we look at the budget of Kharagpur, the revenues are 968 crores. So just remember the fact, 2,100 acres of land, 438 acres of government grant, and 968 crores of revenues. However, the fact is, out of that 968 crores revenue, tuition fee constitutes only 174 crores coming in from the students. The rest of the money comes in from consultancy and research grant. Now, if we see these realities, what are we driving at? What do we mean? What we mean is that on one hand, funding is getting dried up because there are many other ways in which the priorities can be rolled out and the money would be required there. So what does it mean to the educational institutes? Now, based on the, my understanding of the sector, that we need to probably look at this as an inflection point and be ready in terms of reinventing and reorienting a delivery model for higher education. Now, what do we mean by that? Now, on one hand, we have to realize that the new money flow is going to be restricted. So, can we also see another scenario? If we look at the generative AI coming in now, what it is doing is the knowledge which earlier used to last for a lifetime, let's say a degree, somebody graduates, and it would ensure that that person will be employed for life, or the competencies, the knowledge and the skills acquired during that education would last for a lifetime. But gone are the days now, because the half-life period of knowledge is shrinking and new technologies are coming in, new skills are getting required. Now, in that scenario, there could be various ways to respond, and that's the critical point. The first one is that can we have our delivery system be prepared for the future? That means if the skills are getting reinvented, if the knowledge is getting reinvented, instead of charging fee per student for the year or for the course? Can we have education as a plan, meaning education as a service, as a subscription model? Why is that? Because once the student feels that his or her knowledge or competencies are getting relatively less relevant, then they can come back to the university or to the institute and be retooled. They can unlearn and relearn to be ready for the next normal. Second, another new reality is employability. Most of the employers say that that is the issue. So the way to resolve that is also to have incubation centers and innovation centers with the industry on campus. Now, if there is a lot of land, how can we make that land revenue generating on one hand, and on the other hand, have the industry directly interact with the students on campus? Second thing, now we also want the emerging trends to be absorbed by the students. What better way than can have a convention center at our campus as a revenue generating model along with PPP. Now, if we do that, that means newer industry interactions would happen, workshops would happen, the faculty industry immersion can happen, and the faculty can be future ready. If the faculty can be future ready, and once they see what are the emerging trends, they can better impart those skills and knowledge sets to the students. The next one, PPP as the sports, for the sports facilities. Now, sports globally has been a tremendous revenue generator. Also, if we look at the infrastructure available primarily to the government agencies, there is a lot of scope for that. Now, let's look at another segment to the whole thing. Now, it is very difficult for an educational institute to raise funds from the traditional role that they are doing. So, Government of India has created something called Higher Education Finance Agency, HEFA. And based on the numbers which are published, this Higher Education Finance Authority has sanctioned 42,000 crores of loans to educational institutes. Out of that, about 20,971 crores have been disbursed. However, what we are suggesting on this platform is there needs to be a revamp. The current remit or their current mandate is to raise the funds for the government entities and for the educational institutes who are getting funded by the government. Now, on one hand, we have seen the kinds of budgets they have, the kind of infrastructure they have, the kind of recurring income flow that they have. Now, can this Higher Education Finance Agency be remandated to help private educational institutes mobilize funds? Now, why that is important is raising funds is quite critical, and it's a very specialized job. And that's why if we give it to them, where can they raise money? And then I'll just conclude with 2-3 other points related to that. Now, if we look at where the money is, on one hand, let's say there is a scarcity of available funds from the savings of the nation available for the universities. On the other hand, if we create a financially viable models, there is a lot of money available which is chasing returns. Now, how can we do that? For example, housing. Any institute which requires students to stay on campus, and many of them would prefer the faculty to stay on campus, that can be spun off into a REIT, real estate investment trust. Now, the current guidelines do not allow that. But if we create some reforms, and specific reforms we'll talk about, the first one is that whenever in the current income tax code, whatever money got donated under section 80 GGA was used to be 100% tax deductible, which it is not in the new tax code. That can be changed. But more importantly, as we discussed, if those REITs are allowed by the government, that anybody who comes in and invests the income generating asset, because if it's for the student housing or faculty housing, there would be a rent income coming in, and therefore it is an investable funds. Billions of dollars could be raised there. Last 2 points, when we put money in CSR donation can come in, but that money has to be used in the same year. Now, it is impossible for capital expense on infrastructure to be ready within the 12 months period. Therefore, that also reform is required. And the last point we would make is, in the US, there are over 20 universities who have the endowment funds more than $10 billion. Now, everyone talks about endowment, but the biggest enabler, based on my understanding, is the fact that if endowments are allowed to invest, like the Provident Fund. Provident Fund is allowed to invest in equities. If endowment funds are allowed to invest in equities, and the most critical part is, instead of each university trying to go out and create its own endowment plan, which is practically not very easy, Higher Education Finance Agency should be the nodal agency which can ensure that educational institutes can structure their own endowment funds and the financial instruments get available to them, and they go out to the market, to their alumni network, and mobilize those funds, including naming of the professors like the various other developed countries have, and the labs and the research labs named after the donors. So those could be some specific action items or the reforms that could be needed to make sure that India's higher educational institutes are not deprived of the funds, provided they have already reinvented and reoriented themselves to be future ready. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. It was completely power packed. I could gather some of those things. I have noted many of those things. But it's really wonderful. Like, you gave your perspectives on how hybrid models of learning are important. But most importantly, which is a point that I always make, tuition fees becoming the dominant revenue stream has always been an issue. You quoted IIT Kharagpur, which is a public institution, but across institutions, and you also nicely gave some avenues for that, be it the auditorium, events, sports, industry-led, consulting and research and related areas, and some of the other means by which you can read, possibly is now allowed. What I understand from the ministry is there is means of allowing this in public institutions, but as you rightly said, this needs to become a norm where reads are allowed across. So there is government thinking in the right direction, at least on the read side. So that is also happening. HEFA is a topic for another day. There are a lot more reforms that can happen in HEFA, but all I can tell you is even government institutions are fully covered in that. IFIs are allowed, but some of the other institutions pay market rates for that. So HEFA reforms, like I said, are very, very valid point, but for some other day we'll pick that up. But and also you talked about managing the endowment fund that I also said in the beginning, which I think there are many universities in this country who have enough surplus, but they are saying, allow us to manage that fund so that we can help ourselves rather than go and maybe help other educational institutions who need that fund. So, Bohora, I know you have 2 pages of recommendation, but what are your top ones?
I'll stick to 3 only. For the institutes, I think on their website, they can start listing down their course fees, along with that education as a service fee. That means if you want to subscribe to MBA at our institute, or let's say Bachelor's of Engineering for AI for the next 10 years, this is the annual subscription charge, education as a service. Now probably an ask from the central government is empower Higher Education Finance Authority and give them a specific mandate to raise 1 lakh crore for the private institutions from around the world and from India, and enable at least 100 private institutes to start endowment funds. The Higher Education Finance Agency to be mandated with this task over the next 5 to 6 years. And the last one for the corporates, I think for the hostel, which is the low-hanging fruit, which is highly investable as a financial product, encourage them and give them tax incentive to have real estate investment trust worth 1 lakh crores over the next 5 to 6 years, exclusively for the private educational institutes, where the investors' money would come in and would be repaid by the rent that gets collected by the private institutions from the faculty and the students. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. That's very, very clear, and with some parameters, almost a brief. I'm sure FICCI is taking note. We will make sure the relevant stakeholders receive these inputs. Thank you so much.